In my last video, I discussed the fact that the Brighamite Church of Utah is the total diametric opposite of the Joseph Smith original Mormon Church and theology. I showed how the Book of Mormon condemned Solomon and King David as practicing whoredoms, and Lehi had to flee to get away from these Sodom and Gomorrah participants. And these whoredoms included multiple wives and harems. Joseph Smith's original church condemned in its foundational scripture, the Book of Mormon, polygamy, as we know it today in the Brighamite Church. So how did the Brighamite Mormon Utah Church reframe the original Joseph Smith Church into condoning polygamy? Well, it's called word trickery or word magic, or we shall call mass hypnosis. So what you hear from faithful Utah Mormons is that, oh yes, the Lord did condemn King Solomon and King David for practicing whoredoms of polygamy, but later on, God can change his mind, and he granted Brigham Young and the Utah Mormons the right to practice these whoredoms and make these whoredoms sacred. So in face of the Book of Mormon and the foundational scriptures of the original Joseph Smith Church, the Utah Brighamite Church has convinced under a grand trance that somehow you can twist the actual meaning of the words into its total opposite. So how did the Utah Mormon Church become so twisted as to be the polar opposite of Joseph Smith and still consider Joseph Smith their foundational prophet? It's simple. Take an original foundational document, and where it says thou shalt not, just get rid of the not, and then you have thou shalt not practice polygamy turns into thou shalt practice polygamy. Okay? That has been well documented by many scholars, even though it is completely ignored by the mass, by the general population of the Mormons. And later on in this video, I'm going to show you this is exactly what happened to the Joseph Smith revelation on sealing. It was twisted by a few words. So with a few words, it was turned into a document that commanded polygamy. So let's start with the foundational document that many point to as far as Joseph Smith having a revelation of section 132 out of the Doctrine and Covenants authorizing polygamy. It's the William Clayton diary. And everyone accepts this as being authentic and true. But would it surprise you that the William Clayton document has never seen the light of day? Only 4 scholars were allowed into the deep catacombs of the Mormon Church, and they came out saying, and it's based solely on their observations alone, that the William Clayton diary exists, purporting to have translated a Joseph Smith translation of polygamy, 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. While I admire the scholarship of many scholars, I would prefer to see the actual document. Just my suspicious mind. This is an article out of Common Consent discussing the William Clayton diaries. It was October 2017, so if something has changed since then, please, dear viewer, let me know. But this article goes on to state, William Clayton was an early British convert who was the only contemporary account of many of the controversial aspects of life in Nauvoo and polygamy and the rift between Emma and Joseph. I am, this is the author, unfortunately unaware of any provenance of these Clayton journals. They were used by the church historians in preparation of the manuscript history in 1850, supposedly, and they appear to have landed and many other other important documents and items in the personal papers of the Apostles of the Church historian Joseph Fielding Smith, who eventually became president of the church. And a safe containing these papers became what is often referred to as the First Presidency's vault. The materials are archived by the First Presidency and are outside the purview of the LDS Church History Library, and its registers are not public. In other words, they're kept away from public view under lock and key. In the late 1970s, however, the First Presidency granted access to some of these documents in their secret holdings. It appears that several scholars received access to some form of the Nauvoo-era Clayton journals, namely James Allen and Dean Jesse, there's a question mark, Andrew F. Ehart, and Michael Quinn. They each prepared manuscripts of varying quality. I understand that Allen's typescript is the most complete and that Ehart's is the least, comprising approximately half of the holograph text. In my limited experience, Allen's typescript is also the most accurate, with Quinn's being the least. Each scholar used their transcripts for important scholarly contributions at the vanguard of the new Mormon history. That means only 4 people supposedly saw the actual William Clayton diaries, and it's only from their hearsay, their witnessing of these secret journals, that we rely totally on William Clayton being an actual witness to Joseph Smith polygamy revelation of D&C 132. In other words, there's no evidence here. There is William Clayton's diaries that no one has seen except for these 4 chosen scholars, and we're going to find out that Michael Quinn later on said, well, he only did his research off the Allen's typescript. And there is a question mark by Dean Jesse. So right now, the only 2 scholars that people believe may have seen the actual transcript, or they call it the holographic handwritten journal of quote-unquote William Clayton, is Mr. Allen and Mr. Ehart. Please, before you protest that there is a William Clayton diary that is online that you can view, this William Clayton diary is not the one at issue. The William Clayton diary that can be read online is a diary that starts after Joseph Smith's death and basically just documents William Clayton and the Mormon Church travels across the plains to Salt Lake. That's all it concerns. The portion of the William Clayton diary concerning this translation is still under lock and key, unless the church has recently produced it. But I've looked and I have been unable to find it, so I welcome anyone else who can find it for me. So returning to the 2 Mormon scholars' typewritten notes or handwritten notes of what they purport to be a copy of the William Clayton diary, I wish to offer that this evidence would not be allowed in court. This not only violates the hearsay rule, but it is hearsay upon hearsay, but it also violates the courtroom evidence rule of the best evidence. The best evidence is the actual diary, and if the church does have a copy of the actual diary, then it needs to be produced in court before the church claims that it purports to state that Joseph Smith had a revelation on polygamy. And in fact, there is another rule of evidence which is called adverse inference. It is called adverse inference, which means the jury may infer that the refusal to produce a document means that the document works against the interests of the party. In other words, jury may assume it does not contain the revelation on polygamy the church purports it to contain. But the jury may infer. So here is an article written by the Utah Mormon Church going through rhetorical gymnastics in an attempt to convince people that William Clayton and Joseph C. Kingsbury did in fact document Joseph Smith's revelation on polygamy. However, this article is a fine example of word magic, word trickery, and bait and switch. This article contains absolutely no factual evidence that the D&C 132 revelation on polygamy was authored or translated or dictated to William C. Clayton or Joseph Kingsbury. All we have are generalized statements, which could be interpreted in any way, in any manner. But the Mormon apologists want you to accept their interpretation of very vague and very general statements that make absolutely no reference to harem polygamy, Joseph Smith's revelation, or 132 of section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So here's Joseph C. Kingsbury copy of D&C 132. This article is called The Provenance of D&C 132. And it says, it comes from William Clayton, recorded in his journal that he wrote the original revelation on July 12, 1843. Now remember, I just told you nobody's seen the William Clayton journal except for two historians who basically reported on it. Nobody has had access to the actual holograph or transcript. So we have to, under faith, believe that this even exists. Okay, this AM, I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, knowing the design in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon, having many wives and concubines. And C, after it was wrote, President Joseph and Hiram presented it and read it to Emma, who said she did not believe a word of it, and it appeared very rebellious. Again, this is gaslighting or word magic or bait and switch. Nowhere in this passage by William Clayton, purported passage by William Clayton, does he say that Joseph Smith gave him a revelation commanding polygamy. The only reference he has is to Solomon and David having harems. And we already know in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith condemned King David and King Solomon as practicing whoredoms because of their harems. So this passage could be another revelation by Joseph Smith condemning polygamy as a whoredom. Well, that's kind of general, isn't it? And imprecise. That's about the only thing that William Clayton said, is that he wrote some sort of 10-page revelation on the fact that Abraham, David, and Solomon had wives. So I guess from that vague reference, we're supposed to assume that's D&C 132. Could be referring to something else. Then 1 of 2 days later, Newell K. Whitney requested permission to have a copy made. They were showing this revelation around after Emma was supposed to have burned it. But of course, we don't know if she burned it. They were passing it around 2 or 3 days after it was presented to Emma. This is how all these stories go. None of them make sense. Anyway, then 1 or 2 days later, Newell K. Whitney requested permission to copy it. So, just minding his own business in his own office, Joseph C. Kingsbury reports that Newell K. Whitney asked him to copy a document that Newell K. Whitney brought to him. Okay, so do you notice that we don't have any original witnesses to the document at this point in time? Those are called percipient witnesses. So William Clayton would be an original percipient, or he perceived it happening, witness of the revelation, and he would be the only one. Newell K. Whitney only saw a transcription done by William Clayton, so he's not a percipient witness to the actual transaction. So Newell K. Whitney simply takes a document to Joseph Kingsbury and asks him to copy it. Joseph C. Kingsbury described the copying process, and he goes on to say, Bishop Newell K. Whitney handed me the revelation. Okay, so here's Bishop Newell K. Whitney handed me the revelation the day after it was written, or the day following, and stating what it was, and asked me to make a copy. I did so, and then read my copy of it to Bishop Whitney, who compared it with the original, to which he held in his hand while I read to him. When I finished reading, Bishop Whitney pronounced the copy correct. So far, there's been nothing to connect Joseph Smith to the document that Joseph Kingsbury was copying, except for the following, which is a patent bait and switch. To connect Joseph Smith and Hiram to this revelation, they use, or the Utah Mormon Church slips in, a book written by an Andrew Jensen, who has a memory or recollects or documents that somehow he knows that Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith entered the room at the culmination of Joseph Kingsbury finishing the copying process. But nowhere in the William Clayton diary, nowhere in the Kingsbury transcript is this fact stated. It is only inserted like a bait and switch by another non-witness, which is Andrew Jensen, who wrote a book about polygamy years later. The Mormon Church shifts. Do you see how this word magic or deception occurs? While speaking about two original documents, the William Clayton diary and the Joseph Kingsbury journal, they switched to a totally unknown person called Andrew Jensen, and they insert his factual scenario that Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith somehow entered the room. But they make you believe that it's still Newell K. Whitney or Joseph C. Kingsbury still talking about the event of copying the revelation, which it is not. It is a completely independent fact that is inserted from a completely different source. So returning to the article, let's see how the author slips in this unverified fact. And Hiram Smith came into the room at that time to fetch the original. Bishop Whitney handed it to him. I will also state that this copy, as also the original, are identically the same as published in its present condition in 1876 in the Doctrine of Covenants. Clayton later affirmed this, that Kingsbury manuscript was the exact copy. Now here comes the total gaslighting. Neither William Clayton, Newell K. Whitney, or Joseph Kingsbury states anything about Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith entering the room and stating this is the exact same copy or the exact same translation that appears in D&C 132. That is a total fabrication by Mr. Andrew Jensen, some 20 years after the death of Joseph Smith. So you see how the Mormon Church baits and switch and jumbles around documents and inserts non sequiturs all over the place in order to prove their point? Well, I can say it's either incompetence or corruption. They are purposely misleading the public because, as the adverse inference rule states, they don't have a case that Joseph Smith ever authorized polygamy. However, we do have a witness who testified in court, testifying that he observed the first draft of the William Clayton translation by Joseph Smith in the possession of Newell K. Whitney. It was Joseph Smith's personal secretary, James Whitehead, who testified in a temple lot case, which was a court case where there was some dispute over land where a temple was supposed to be built in Missouri. and the Utah Mormon Church intervened and attempted to persuade the court that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. At the end of all the testimony, the judge determined that everyone was lying, that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, and there was no credible evidence to show that he did. Here's the Temple Lot case, abstract of evidence, page 473. James Whitehead being sworn states as follows. I was the private secretary to the prophet Joseph Smith and was so engaged at the time of his death and had been engaged for over 2 years. He states, I do not know anything about the doctrine of polygamy ever having been taught by the church by Joseph Smith at any time before his death. I never heard him teach it either publicly or privately. And he goes on to say he had many occasions to hear the prophet preach in his office while he was present, James Whitehead was present, and in his home, Joseph Smith's home, when James White was present. He said that there was no other elder at that time occupying the position of private secretary to the prophet. I knew a man by the name of Kingsbury. Joseph Kingsbury did not have anything to do whatsoever with the duties of secretary to the prophet Joseph Smith. I also knew William Clayton, knew him in England before he came to this country, and also knew him after he came to Nauvoo. During the time I was performing the duties of secretary to the prophet, Clayton was a clerk in the office quite a while. He did not have the same duties to perform that I had. He was there helping on the books and doing whatever he was directed. William Clayton was there in the office before I was, but there was a time came he was removed from his position of private secretary by Joseph Smith and the committee on the Temple Committee, because at that time I was appointed because there was something that took place in connection with Clayton's work that gave dissatisfaction. There was some money disappearance, and Clayton was to blame for it, and for that reason he was removed from that office. That occurred in 1843, in the beginning of that year. And there are other documents to show that Joseph Smith started suspecting there was large monies being stolen from the temple fund, and that Brigham Young was probably responsible for siphoning off these funds through William Clayton. Poor William Clayton. He seems to be the one that is the scapegoat in this whole scenario. The fact that William Clayton was demoted or fired by Joseph Smith for financial impropriety answers a question I had when I first read it. For some reason, William Clayton had sought protection from Brigham Young because he stated that Hosea Stout, police chief of Nauvoo, had threatened to kill him. That is, Hosea Stout, police chief of Nauvoo, had threatened to kill William Clayton, and William Clayton was very scared and requested protection from Brigham Young. So if in fact William Clayton stole church temple funds and siphoned them off to, say, the Quorum of the 12 through Brigham Young, and after being caught and demoted by Joseph Smith, perhaps William Clayton started having second thoughts and loose lips, or told somebody he felt like disclosing this to Joseph Smith. Well, that certainly would be incentive for the culprits who were responsible for the theft to threaten William Clayton's life to shut him up. So this is the best theory I have right now why William Clayton was threatened by Hosea Stout. Interesting web we weave when first we take to deceive. And through my reading of church history, William Clayton certainly seemed to be the saddest character of all. He was loyal to the end to Brigham Young, but was never given any respect. He held very nominal positions in the Mormon Church in Utah and basically could barely make a living, not like the other church leaders who became millionaires. So William Clayton is the sad, tragic anti-hero of the Smith and Brighamite story. So returning to the courtroom transcript of James Whitehead, personal secretary of Joseph Smith. So after Clayton was removed, he did outside work, looking for the property of the church on the outside. The revelation that Whitney showed me was only on the matter of sealing. That was before the church went to Salt Lake City. It was after the death of Joseph Smith that Newell K. Whitney showed James Whitehead this revelation on sealing. The circumstances under which Whitney showed it to me. I went up to winter quarters. This is James Whitehead again. I went up to winter's quarters or Omaha to settle my account of the church and make my report. I stayed all night with Bishop Whitney, and he showed me this revelation. That was in the spring of 1848. The document was about as much as would fill both sides of a sheet of foolscape. About 3 sides of a sheet of paper like that. It was written, I did not write it. I read it. In other words, he's saying, being a private secretary to Joseph Smith, I certainly would have seen or written this document on sealing before Joseph Smith died. But now, James Whitehead is saying, I'm quite surprised because this was a document I did not write, and this was the first time I saw it in 1848. But notwithstanding, it was a document dealing only with sealing and not with polygamy. So it says, I think that the handwriting was in William Clayton's hand. I've never seen it since that time. I've never been near the church since that time. I do not know because I never saw it in print. I only saw it when it was published in the Doctrine and Covenants by Brigham Young. But James Whitehead wants to emphasize, but the one published in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, referring to section 132, by the Utah Church was not the one or the translation that Bishop Whitney showed me at winter quarters. It was not the same at all. It was entirely changed. It was so changed that it sanctioned or authorized polygamy, and that change was made by the Brighamites. For there is no such thing in it when I read it. And he's referring, you can find it for yourself in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, published by the Brighamites in Salt Lake. You will see it published by them, that it sanctions or imposes polygamy on the church. But there was no such thing in the revelation that Whitney showed me. I remember when I first saw the revelation they have in their Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and it was brought to me by a man from Salt Lake. And I told him I had never seen such a document. He goes on down here to say, Joseph Smith had one wife only that I know of, and that was Emma Smith. Then on cross-examination, the book is marked A. It's the Doctrine and Covenants with the polygamy revelation in it. And James Whitehead says, I can swear positively that this is not the same Whitney revelation that was handed to me at winter's quarters, that I read at winter's quarters. I said they had taken parts of the revelation, added to it in such a way as to change its meaning entirely. I did not say that it was the same revelation, and I do not say it now. It is not the same revelation. But if there are any parts in this revelation that Whitney showed me in this Doctrine and Covenants revelation, it has been so mutilated and changed around as to entirely change its meaning from what it was. I will swear positively that the revelation that Whitney showed me was not the same published in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. So remember, this is courtroom testimony done under oath in an actual trial. So James Whitehead testimony that Joseph Smith did not authorize polygamy carries more weight in the hierarchy of evidence. This courtroom testimony done under oath carries substantially more weight than any scribbles in a diary or any remembrances done by the Mr. Jensen done 20 years after Joseph Smith's death. So as any good researcher, it is always best to have more than one source. Perhaps 3 sources is kind of the threshold of presenting your evidence. So I'm going to present two more sources, documentary sources, which establishes Joseph Smith's mindset and desire before he was assassinated. There is a transcript of a conference talk given on April 8, 1844 by Hiram Smith, and it was transcribed by Willard Richards. I will leave the link. I found this conference talk given by Hiram Smith on April 8, 1844, explains what sealing means. Hiram is attempting to explain to some missionaries who are being set apart to go into the field what the new revelation concerning sealing means, because he has heard whisperings that it involved polygamy. And what he stated to the congregation is this: Hiram condemns absolutely the practice of having more than one wife at a time on earth. He uses his own personal experience. Hiram's first wife, Jerusha Barton, died in 1837 before the sealing ritual was revealed to Joseph Smith. Worried his wife died before the revelation, he went to Joseph Smith and wanted to know about being sealed to his new wife, at least in heaven. So Smith considered this and had a revelation which solved Hiram's dilemma. Hiram could be sealed to Jerusha for eternity, as well as his living wife sealed to Mary Fielding. Hiram says, well, if this is defined as spiritual wifery, then let it be so. But such celestial marriage to a deceased loved one in no way mimics harem polygamy, or having more than two living wives on earth and married to them. Hiram states that since Jerusha is dead, technically she can be called a spiritual wife, but this does not authorize having more than two living wives sharing one man on earth. Hiram clearly condemns the rumor that he or anyone else is authorized to be married to more than one woman at a time on this earth, and to do so is, I quote, an abomination. Despite Hiram's clear statement against harem polygamy as practiced by the Brighamite Utah Mormons, Smith and Hiram Smith make it very clear that the sealing of celestial wives in no way authorizes having more than one wife on this earth. So in this conference talk to departing Mormon missionaries, Hiram tries to distinguish between the concept of sealing in heaven from the practice of being married to two wives who are living. It is clear that the Smith enemies have taken the spiritual wifery doctrine of celestial sealing to more than one wife to mean that you can marry more than one wife on earth. And this was John Bennett's version of spiritual wifery. This insistence by Smith's enemies that spiritual wifery or celestial sealing meant that you could have more than two wives living on earth is a source of frustration and exasperation by the Smith brothers. So my third source is just the short aside of exasperation by Joseph Smith in the June 8th, 1844 and the June 10th, 1844 trial on whether to deem the Expositor a nuisance. Again, in this trial, another proceeding that is recognized by authorities, in this trial of the Nauvoo City Council, Joseph Smith bemoans the fact that he is still having to defend his theory or his practice of sealing in the celestial kingdom to being compared to polygamy on this earth. He clearly states, I had no intention of ever authorizing being married to more than one person while living. Now, if you can hear the frustration in my voice, it's simply because there is no convincing, even with absolute evidence, people who choose to believe the opposite of what the evidence shows. The Utah Mormon Church theology rests solely, almost exclusively, on the new and everlasting covenant of celestial marriage, which means polygamy. And that if you are a Utah Mormon, you must practice polygamy, or you cannot achieve the highest level in the celestial kingdom. This is not a principle practiced or preached by Joseph Smith. In fact, if he had all the dalliances and extramarital relations that he's being accused of, there's still no evidence that Joseph Smith stated that polygamy was required to enter the celestial kingdom. His sealing principle was made in response to Hiram Smith's marriage to one wife who has died and another wife is living, and he wanted the chance to be sealed to both in the celestial kingdom. Now, I can give my own opinion about this predicament that Hiram Smith stated to Joseph Smith. I believe Hiram Smith was set up by Mary Fielding, who knows when she secretly married Heber C. Kimball, but she was married to Heber C. Kimball within days of Hiram Smith's death. So it is my belief that Mary Fielding was a plant and a traitor to Hiram and Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo Mormon Church.